What I want to start off with, as I always do, is start off with just a brief overview of where things stand. And keep in mind a couple things. When I prepare for this, I'm looking at our survey, I'm looking at some of the national surveys like Citibank, Wells Fargo, Peer Monitor, as well as talking to some individual consultants and try to get a sense of where things are at. And the one thing I've learned over the years is that they all differ in different ways, and it depends on the time of year the survey is taken, who's responding, the different data points that they focus on. So just keep that in mind. The one thing that, and I was saying this to Gina as we were walking over, I think data, whether it's the legal world, journalism, data is important. It can give you lots of clues. It is not the be-all and end-all. That's what I would encourage. And I think I say that a little bit later on in this presentation, and I would just keep in mind, you have to sort of assess all this stuff, and I say this in my forecast article. I think it's important to look at the commonality between various surveys and pay attention to that and map it against where you're at. And where it comes to the outlier notions or outlier theories of some of the other surveys, keep them in mind, don't ignore them, but don't be a slave to it. And always, trust your gut. So overall, 2014, all the surveys generally bear out that 2014 was better than 2013. Most of the national surveys suggest that right now, though, that revenue year over year is falling short of where 2014 was. And that, in fact, that demand and work may be down so much in the last quarter of 2015 that it may spill over to 2016. We wrote about it the other day. The Citi report said that revenue was up only 3.6% versus 4% last year, and only 1.8% in Pennsylvania. When I saw the presentation the other week in New Jersey from Kim, she said that looking at September 2014 versus September 2015, that both demand and productivity, demand was down 2% and productivity was down 3%. That's sobering statistics. Now, when you look at how 2014 fared, and again, this is a snapshot. You can't judge everyone's success or failures based on this, but I think it gives a reasonable snapshot of where things are. If you look at the 14 firms that are on either AmLaw's 100 or 200 from Pennsylvania, they did much better in 2014 than 2013. Only 2 were down compared to 6 in 2013. The interesting thing in that, and I found this fascinating, was that the overall total revenue generated, though, the increase was smaller in 2014 than it was in 2013. One of the buzzwords last year in my forecast article, I think I talked about in this presentation, and it was all the Wells Fargo, Citibank, all of them were talking about stratification. The AmLaw 50 are doing so much better than the second half of the 100, and the 100 is doing so much better than 200, and everyone mid-size is in trouble. And we sort of saw that if you looked at the Pennsylvania AmLaw 100 and 200 firms, we did see a little bit of that stratification. Not so this year. That's not what the statistics are showing. That's not what the studies are showing. It was interesting, and I almost sense in some of the surveys and studies I've looked at, they're sort of backpedaling a little bit, Like, whoa, the AmLaw 50 did so well this year, it put them in a deficit, put them in a tough spot to show it. Well, if your whole theory is that AmLaw 50 will continue better than anybody, that should be the trend, and it's not. And so you see, I talked to a couple people, most of the statistics I've seen is that AmLaw 50 aren't doing so well compared to year over year. And one consultant I talked to said that really mid-sized firms, and she defined mid-sized firms as, from about, I'd say about, around 130, to, I don't know where it would take you to be slightly below the AmLaw 350. And she said that they were really, year over year, their growth was greater than AmLaw 200, 100, and AmLaw 50. So given that, and I've talked individually, because I looked at some of this data, I'm calling up some of these consultants, I'm saying, wait a minute, everyone talked about segmentation last year. What gives? And what I've heard generally, and it makes sense, and I think look, it's just common sense in some ways. They said, look, in the past, if especially in the go-go days of the early 2000s when everyone was growing, and it was really a debate about, were you growing 14% year over year or 4%? Now it's not the case. And one consultant I really highly value, she said to me, look, it's less about being part of a segment. You are not going to just move up based on either what region or what size or what practice areas. It's going to be much more about individual firm performance. Now, that makes sense to me because I don't believe that, that life is, we're all dictated by and subject to forces and have no, way of differentiating ourselves. I think in terms of predicting, it's going to get a lot more difficult. I think that both presents opportunities and challenges for law firms, and particularly for you as marketers, I think it presents opportunities. One thing I don't really talk about here, but I hear consistently, is that it's probably never risky, it's never been a tougher time to grow revenue, it's probably never an easier time to lose clients, but conversely, it may be never an easier time to sort of get clients or get market share, depending on your strategy. Having said all that stuff, what our managing partner survey showed, this is one of the more optimistic ones I've seen in recent years. You'll see in a second, most of the key financial drivers, revenue, profits, gross revenue, it's all up. And things like layoffs, and I think even maybe de-equitization, was it down? I think de-equitization was down a little bit. And the one come away that I get from looking at this stuff, Pennsylvania sometimes gets knocked by national consultants for not being, maybe not having quite the PPP of some of the New York, the Wall Street firms or Silicon Valley firms, and maybe not being so far out there on certain aspects. But the one thing, and I don't say this to cater to this audience at all, I think it's hard to argue that the Pennsylvania firms are pretty well run. There's different strategies, and look, I've talked to some people and they say, look, there's a lot of smaller, mid-sized firms that are really struggling, you're just not going to hear about it, and that may be the case. But I have to say, of the large Pennsylvania firms, if you look at year-over-year performance, no one's been consistently down. So another contrast, so now that I'm in charge of New Jersey, we started doing a New Jersey, this was the first year we did a New Jersey Managing Partners survey, and I was looking at their stats, and I don't have them here, but generally their survey results are generally more pessimistic than Pennsylvania's. And even though New Jersey has a very similar market in a lot of ways, if you look at the financial success or lack of success among their 20 largest firms, they're struggling. Year over year, most of the firms are down, and they're down. Like you'll see in a second, or you'll see when we print the magazine on Tuesday, generally when Pennsylvania firms are down, it's 1% to maybe even 2%. I don't even know if we've gotten to 2%. There, some large firms, 4, 6, 12%. So keep that in mind, And what I've asked the New Jersey folks, we're trying to figure out, well, why? But that's more about New Jersey. But I think the one takeaway I come with all the statistics and all the information is that I think the Pennsylvania firms are fairly well run. Maybe they don't ride the high, but they don't hit the low. A couple other trends, like this, I'm sure, but still, what keeps coming through? Things are more competitive, more pressure on rates. Another thing, and I don't get into this in this presentation, I think Gina does in her article, is that consolidation is having a greater, convergence, consolidation is having a greater impact on law firms and losing clients, and it's definitely happening. And it's something that's been said to me. I haven't seen a whole lot of studies on it, but it's something that's said to me repeatedly, again, by consultants. And I go to consultants because they get an overview. They all a lot of times have their sort of spin, but they're generally the ones I talk to are fairly objective, and they can give me a broad perspective. So, just again, to give you just a flavor of where things are and how things have panned out, in my forecast article in 2013, I said the best that I thought firms could do for 2014 was between 3% and 7%. And as you can see, of the 14 PA Am Law 100, 200 firms, 2 firms were down, 5 firms grew less than 3%, and 7 firms grew more than 3%. And of those 7, 5 of them grew more than 5%. And we had 2, I think, that were at 10%. So it was pretty impressive. For 2016, I've asked, I love to stump consultants. I said, so all right, so what's the best average good year people can expect in this market? And then I also say, what's the average worst year? And they're all like, well, I don't want to venture on what the average worst year could be. But they've said, and I'm almost like looked at them because a few years ago they wouldn't have said this with a straight face, but they say with a straight face. They said between 0 and 2% revenue growth. That's that's average. But they say in this market, if you can come away with that for 2016, that's a good year. In looking at all the statistics, I'll just nudge it one little bit. I'm a little bit more of an optimist, and I would say for me, a reasonable optimistic expectation for revenue growth in 2016 would be between 0 and 3%. But again, to put it in perspective and give you an idea where things are headed, think about it. 2014, I said between 3 and 7%. Last year, I said between 0 and 5%, and now I'm saying between 0 and 3%. It's not by accident.